Best buddies, a scary encounter. Once I finished brushing my teeth, I finally stripped off and jumped into bed with a sigh of relief. My brother was visiting and should have arrived by now, but was late, so I contacted him. I sent him a text, letting him know I would be asleep when he arrived. I told him to use the key I had given to him to let himself in, and informed him the spare bed was made, and to not make much noise as I had to be up early. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke to the noise of my brother stumbling around my pitch-black room. I could barely make out his shadow as he crawled into the opposite side of my bed. Groggily, I mumbled, "Jesus, Tommy, I told you to sleep in the spare room. If you snore, I'm kicking you out." Turning my back to him, I felt around to find my phone on the locker. Swiping it to reveal the time, 3:23 a.m. One missed call, and a message from Tommy. I canceled both, and placed the phone back down and closed my eyes. Heavy breathing filled the silence, and angrily I groaned, "Stop breathing so heavy or get out and go to the other room." I closed my eyes, and then there was silence. His back was pressed hard against mine, but I fell asleep regardless. I awoke to my alarm at 6:45 a.m., rolled over, and was shocked to see Tommy was not there. So I shouted for him. I got no answer, so I slipped on my dressing gown and checked the kitchen and the rest of the house. He was nowhere to be found. Confused, I picked up my phone to text him and see where he had gone so early. I opened the message I had canceled from him when I awoke last night. Chills ran down my spine as I read the message. "Sorry, bro. I'm not going to make it to yours until tomorrow evening. I will explain when I see you." Panicked, I rang him over and over until finally in a sleepy voice he answered. He informed me that he was still in bed and a 5-hour drive away, and apologized for the mix-up and that he would see me soon. He also told me to look up his Snapchat story to see the girl he had met and hooked up with. I checked the story to confirm, and sure enough, at 2:55 a.m., he was partying with a beautiful blonde by his side, hours away from my house, in a club in the city. My blood ran cold, and my heart pounded in my chest. As I slowly began room by room searching my house, I found nothing. What climbed into my bed last night? Who or what was the dark figure I felt breathing on my neck and laying beside me? I felt its weight beside me in my bed. I spoke to it, and it fell eerily silent and stopped breathing loudly in my ear. I think sometimes some questions are best left unanswered, and maybe for now it's best to sleep with the lights on. Footsteps. This happened when I was on vacation. I don't want to say when or where, because I don't want to draw any negative attention to the area. But it was a very interesting town, that it still had cobblestone streets. During the daytime it was quite busy outside, but the town shut down pretty early. The streets were dead at night, and nearly everything was closed. So although I was able to get out and do things during the day, I spent a lot of time at night simply in my hotel room. I am more of an outdoor than an indoor person, so I wasn't able to spend all of my vacation nights sitting in a hotel and watching television. If you're wondering why a person like me would take a vacation in an area like this, it was actually only one of several places I was visiting on that vacation, and it was very nice during the day. Also, I simply was not aware that the town was like this. After doing this for several days, I finally had to get out of the hotel at night and find something to do. Even if nothing was open, I could still go for a nice walk. I noticed a few interesting things as I was walking around the town. At first, it really was dead, and very dark. I didn't see any people, and the lights in all the buildings were all off. There were some street lamps, but not many of them, and it was very, very creepy. I could hear my footsteps really clearly on the cobblestone streets with every footstep I took. I had been out for a little bit of time when I noticed what first seemed to me to be an echo of my own footfalls. However, I wasn't at all sure why they would be echoing, so I stopped walking for a moment, and I heard a few footfalls off in the distance. The strange thing to me was that after a couple footfalls, they stopped. I looked around to see if I could see another person out, because it would have been nice to run into someone. I didn't see anyone though, so I figured maybe it was someone walking in one of the alleys then. I began walking again. I'd only taken a few steps, however, when I started hearing that strange echo effect. So once again I stopped walking, and just like the previous time, the other walker took just a few steps, and then stopped walking altogether. It was almost like whomever it was had been trying to either keep time with me, or disguise the footfalls altogether. After looking around again, I still couldn't see anyone. Once I started walking again, I again heard the echo effect start up. Now by this point I was starting to get a little concerned. I didn't know who else was out there, but whoever it was happened to not only be very aware of my footfalls, but was trying to match them for some reason. And I couldn't imagine that whatever reason that was could be good. So I turned around. I decided it wasn't a good idea to tempt fate. If someone was out there and messing with me, it just made more sense for me to head back to my hotel room, so that is exactly what I did. Of course, the footfalls continued to try and match mine. When I sped up a little bit, they sped up a little bit. If I slowed, they slowed. And whenever I looked around in the area they seemed to be coming from, I was unable to see anyone. My simple concern began to turn to fear, and I was about to simply break into a run back to my hotel. But have you ever been scared that you are being followed and for some reason you are afraid to run? It's almost like you feel the person following you is daring you to run, so they can break into a run and chase you. I felt that way when scared before, and I was feeling that way at that moment too. I sped up a little bit, and that was when I finally heard the footfalls start falling faster than my own. I was terrified at that point and burst into a run. I didn't hear the footfalls running after me though. I turned back for a second to look, but didn't see anyone. When I turned back around, I nearly ran into a man who had just turned a corner. I was about to scream, but realized the man was a police officer. I wasn't used to the uniforms the officers had in that country. He asked me if I was okay, and I told him I thought someone might have been following me. That was when he said the most chilling thing I have ever heard in my life. "You shouldn't be out here after dark, ma'am," the officer told me. "2 women have been murdered at night in the past month. We've been recommending everyone stay at home after dark." I told him I wasn't from the area and was staying in a hotel. He then escorted me back there. That was going to be my last night in that town no matter what, since I was catching a train the following day. I'm just happy it didn't end up being my last night on Earth. There was no way for me to know that the person I heard walking was the murderer, but his weird behavior, matching my footfalls, made it seem quite plausible. The View. A few years ago, I got into this relationship with someone I met online. We shared a particular interest and began talking on a forum. Although I hadn't been in a relationship for a while by choice, instead working on myself, We both very quickly began falling for each other, but the difficult part was that he lived across the country from me. He worked in a mine, and he worked really strange hours, so it was sometimes difficult for him to find time to get away. So that meant if we were going to meet, then I was going to have to travel to meet him. I don't really like being away from my home too much, but again, I absolutely adored him, so I went ahead and went. So I'm going to have to explain what it was like being at his place. First, he lived on top of a hill in a very nice neighborhood. He worked in a gold mine, and I suppose from what he told me, he got paid very well. He lived close to a mountain range and had a beautiful view of the Rocky Mountains from his back window. And he had a dog named Buck. He was a small beagle. He was very well behaved. He would have to work long hours in the mine. He would leave and generally be gone for 17 hours. He would come home, eat, we would sleep for a while, and then he would go back to work. He worked in a weird pattern where he did this for 7 days and then had 6 days off. And during the time that he was working, it was mostly just Buck and me. We'd watch TV, I let him run around in the backyard, and I would sit there and watch the view. And God, it was a beautiful view. And side note, the picture on the screen is the actual view. Now, you have to understand that especially with his work schedule, my schedule was all over the place. So many times I would let Buck out at night. He would go out and play around, and I would be there in a chair watching what was happening. I woke up late one night, and Buck needed to go outside. I let him outside without turning the lights on. I went to get a drink, and when I came back, I heard Buck make the worst noise I have ever heard a dog make. I turned on the outside lights, and there was a huge man dressed in black, holding Buck up by the neck. I was terrified, but thank God, my fight-or-flight instinct kicked in. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace, ran out, and knocked the asshole upside the head. He groaned and dropped Buck, who simply laid on the ground. The guy fell over a bit, but he got up quickly. He looked at me, and I swear to God, I thought he was going to attack me, even with the poker in my hand. So I moved to hit him again, and this time buried the poker in his shoulder. And that was it. He ripped it out and then ran off, jumping over the gate, and he was gone. Buck was okay. He was a bit rattled, but no real damage was done. The guy was found and arrested based on my description. He told the police some stupid story that the dog had attacked him, which made no sense since he would have had to jump the gate in order to get into the yard. So if the dog had attacked him, he would have already been trespassing. He tried to sue me for an assault, but the case was never taken up by any lawyers. Some people are deeply stupid. The cabin. This isn't a really long story, but it was definitely a terrifying one. I rented a cabin quite a while ago, so I could have a nice vacation out in the country. I'd never done something like that before, and wasn't really even sure how to go about it. I eventually found an advertisement through an online service, which was likely Craigslist, I don't recall. But it was someone who owned a cabin and was renting it out for certain weeks during the summer. I got in touch with him, although I never met him in person. I paid the rent for the cabin, and he gave me the keys and the address. So I set out for a couple weeks, where I thought I would just commune with nature and be at peace. The cabin was nice and secluded. It was exactly the sort of thing I'd been looking for. So I settled in, and I had a really good time. After being in the cabin for about a week, I was going to bed pretty early one night. Something woke me up, and for a few moments, I wasn't sure exactly what it was, but then I became very aware of it. There was a light coming from under the door, and there were people talking in the other room. I can never really tell you how terrifying this was. I felt a shockwave go through my body, and I was numb for a few moments. I couldn't really think of what to do, and finally I realized that I needed to be quiet and try to listen to what the intruders were saying, rather than immediately assume the worst. So I listened, and I regretted very much what I heard. There were two distinct voices, and although I cannot tell you the exact words they were saying, they were talking about someone being in the cabin. One told the other to go into the kitchen and grab a knife from the cutting block. I was terrified. I was absolutely positive that I was going to lose my life in the next few minutes. And it seemed like time was moving both really fast and really slow at the same time. I couldn't make up my mind to do anything quick enough that would result in me getting away from the intruders. The bedroom door opened, and the light came on. I saw an older man, maybe around 60 years old, holding a gun pointed right at me. Beside him was a woman of his age, holding a kitchen knife. But the strangeness of the appearance of these burglars wasn't what caught me off guard. What really surprised me was how afraid both of them looked. I don't want to go into too much detail about how things were worked out between the three of us. Suffice to say that no one got hurt. They were the owners of the cabin. The person who rented it to me wasn't someone they even knew of. They were simply coming to spend some time in their forest cabin when they noticed my car after arriving late. They were as scared as I had been. Fortunately, they didn't hold anything against me. We both tried to press charges against the man who rented the place, but we were never able to find him. Prom night. The time that I grew up in is so much very different than times are now. With the world connected by the internet and cable television and cell phones, it seems like it's much more difficult to get away with bad things nowadays than it used to be. And if you want to use your imagination to know just how bad some of those things could be, you would likely be right on point. I grew up out in the country. I had a lot of relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins. We all knew each other well. We were spread out in the tri-state area of West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. We didn't have a TV growing up, and it wouldn't have done us much good even if we did have one. There would have been no way that we would have been able to get any sort of reception. We did have radios, though, and that would be the main form of our entertainment and news at home. We also did not have a telephone. I remember sometimes my parents would get us in the car and take us to our cousin's house in town just so they could make a phone call somewhere. It's important to understand what things were like at this time, so this story will be more believable. I've told it to a lot of my younger relatives, and they don't believe it. But they think that things were always like they were today, but of course they were not. I used to hang out with my cousin Tommy a whole lot when we were growing up. We were pretty close in age. Not only that, but a lot of my cousins were girls, and we were the only two boys who were really close in age. So we were pretty close as we grew up, and we were typical country boy types growing up. We went camping, hunting, and fishing. It was Tommy who taught me how to shoot my first gun. We were 12 at the time, and his dad had bought him a gun. Like I mentioned, it's not something you would expect to happen much nowadays, but it was really not so unusual back then. We were friends from childhood, and would spend the summers pretty much all together. When we got into high school, Tommy developed his first real enemy. There was a boy named Brian, who was pretty popular in school. He was also a bit of a bully. Brian did a whole lot of crap, and he was always able to get away with it. The reason why was that Brian's second cousin was the county sheriff, and he came from a family that was long and deeply involved in the politics of the area. They were also quite well known for being very, very crooked. Most people would not want to cross anyone in the family for fear of ending up laying dead in the Ohio River, or something worse. Tommy wasn't the type to be afraid of anything, and he wasn't the type to stand down from anyone either. Naturally, a guy like Brian thought himself a sort of alpha wolf type of character, so he naturally hated it when anyone wasn't afraid of him. So he and Tommy had a lot of clashes, beginning in Tommy's freshman year. Things didn't get better as Tommy was a sophomore and a junior. He and Brian were always butting heads, but surprisingly enough, it had never gotten violent, and it remained that way until they were in their senior years. Now, for the life of me, I do not know what the two guys got into a fight over. I haven't the slightest. But it was during the outside period we had after lunch, and I was looking to find Tommy when people began running because there was a fight. And although I didn't know Tommy was involved in the fight at the time, I did hear that Brian was indeed one of the participants. Well, by the time I got over to the area that the fight was taking place in, it had reached its end, and I was surprised at what I was looking at. Tommy was standing over a bloodied Brian, who was yielding the fight. That was something that no one had ever seen before, and it brought an obvious overload of embarrassment onto Brian. He clearly told Tommy in front of everyone there, "I'm gonna be the death of you someday." Well, I was scared. I think anyone in their right mind would have been, knowing the connections that Brian's family had. But Tommy wasn't worried. It didn't bug him at all. The rest of the school year went by normally. But on prom night, Tommy was supposed to drive over and pick me up, so we could then go and pick up our dates together. But he was late. I kept waiting for him to show up, but a couple hours passed by, and he never did. I mentioned before that we didn't have a phone, so I couldn't call him to see what was going on. I also couldn't bail on my prom date. My dad let me borrow the keys to his truck, and I went to pick up the girl I was seeing. Just as confused as I was, she insisted that we drive over to Tommy's house. When we got there, Tommy's parents were surprised to see me. I asked them if they had seen Tommy, and they told me he had left hours ago to go and pick me up for the prom. I let them know that he never showed up, and then we got very, very worried. We skipped the prom to go search for Tommy. Eventually we found his car. It was abandoned on the side of the road. After looking around in the area, we were unable to locate Tommy or any trace of him. There was nothing in the car to indicate that he was in an accident or anything like that. The car was parked and the keys were missing. We called the sheriff's office. Tommy didn't come home that night. He didn't come home over the weekend. We had no communication from him. The sheriff's office was unable to find anything, though they insisted that they had been intensely searching for him. I had my doubts. They eventually listed him as missing and quit actively trying to find him. Tommy didn't show up in the weeks leading into summertime. He didn't show up during the summer at all. We knew he didn't run away, because he would have taken his car with him if he had. Plus, he had no reason to. Although the sheriff's office insisted he probably just skipped town. In the early fall, I was sitting on the porch when I saw Tommy's car pull up the driveway. Since Tommy had been missing, his younger brother had been driving it. It was indeed his younger brother Travis who got out of the car, and he looked awful. I got up and ran over to Travis, calling to my parents as I did. He was white, and we had to take him and sit him down on the porch. When we did, he told us the most awful thing we had ever heard in our life. Their father had been out in the fields that day. He had smelled something dreadful and followed it to one of the scarecrows. The scarecrow smelled so unbelievably vile, and he wasn't sure why. So I felt around on it and realized it wasn't a scarecrow. Taking off his mask, he discovered a corpse within the clothes of the scarecrow. Underneath the scarecrow's outfit, it had on the clothing that Tommy was wearing on prom night. We knew what happened. We knew it had to do with Brian somehow. But when it was investigated by the sheriff, Brian's relative, they never solved it. Brian was never suspected by them. Surprise, surprise. Me, I knew better. I knew it was Brian, finally getting his retaliation for losing that fight to Tommy. The only happy ending this story could have is that Brian was stabbed in a bar fight less than a year later and died of the injury. And when the death was investigated, interestingly enough, no one in the bar knew who had stabbed him. Funny how things work. Horace. I grew up in urban areas, although the majority of my family lived in more rural areas. My parents had been raised in the country, but they really had no desire to remain in that sort of area. So after they got married, they moved quite a bit away from the rest of the family. However, we would visit our relatives several times a year, and during the summertime, I would very often spend the entire summer at my aunt's house. My aunt lived in one of those really country areas. You had to drive over an hour on dirt and gravel roads to get to her house. And even then, the houses were so spread out that you may have been within walking distance of the other houses, but it would have been a big walking distance. But I loved it. There were so many hills and forests and all sorts of places for me to explore. It was nothing like living in the city. I think the only thing I missed was the air conditioning, and even that wasn't the biggest deal to me when I was younger. My aunt's only child was a boy who was a year younger than me. He was more used to the area that he lived in and spent a lot of time outdoors. He went on little hikes as well, but he usually waited until I was around before going on any long hikes. Both of his parents worked, and so during the day in the summer, we were usually left to ourselves to find a way to be entertained. I was 12 years old the year that this story takes place. It was a hot, midsummer day. My cousin Joey and I were playing with G.I. Joe figures, and we were very bored. That's when we decided to go out exploring in the woods. We were allowed to do it, as long as we didn't venture very far off. However, this time, his parents would not be home for a very long time. So we decided that we'd go deeper into the forest than usual. We had a watch, so we would be able to get back home in time, and none would be the wiser. So we set off in the morning. It was so long ago, but I remember this time we went straight back from behind the house. There was a barbed wire fence that we had to get over, but this was not an obstacle for two boys who were on an adventure. It wasn't too long until we had left familiar territory. We were smart enough to bring a backpack with some drinks and snacks. We were dumb enough to have brought cans of Pepsi as opposed to bringing water. But hey, we didn't think about that sort of thing back then. As far as we knew, Pepsi was just as hydrating as water. I won't go into too much of the exploring because really that sort of thing is pretty boring if you're not there doing it. So I'll just go ahead and tell you about what happened to us out there. Well, we got lost. We didn't have a compass, and we wouldn't have known what to do with one even if we had one. We had traveled so far out that we didn't even have any familiar landmarks or any idea where we were. Our only plan was to try to keep walking in a straight line, hope that we came to a gravel road at some point, and use that to find our way back home. And that's when we came across something we didn't expect. It was an old cabin. Yes, cliché I know, but there really are old cabins out there. Small and a bit dilapidated. We didn't expect anyone to be there, but it looked like somebody was sitting out in the front of it, on a chair. So we thought perhaps it was some old hermit or someone who might be able to help us find our way back to civilization. And yes, I realize asking a hermit to show you the way to civilization is very ironic, but we didn't know what else to do. As we approached closer and closer, we realized that it wasn't a person sitting in the chair. It was a scarecrow. I mean, it wasn't set up in a field to scare crows, but it was definitely a fake straw-filled man. It was just sitting in the chair. And then we heard a voice from inside the cabin. "Be right there, Horace." We were confused and beginning to get a little frightened. However, before we had a chance to react in any way, an old, smelly, and ragged old man came out of the small cabin. He was carrying 2 bowls of some sort of food. When he saw us, he almost dropped the food. "Are you bugging Horace?" he asked us, his voice quite angry. We assumed Horace was the scarecrow sitting in the chair. We denied that we were bugging him, and just told the man that we were trying to find our way out of the woods. The old man looked over at the scarecrow. He babbled some incoherent things at it, before turning back to us. "That's not how Horace tells it." He scowled at us. "I'm getting my shotgun." The man turned to go back into the cabin. Joey and I didn't need an invitation to run away at that point. The 2 of us turned and booked it in the opposite direction of the cabin. We ran and we did not look back. When we heard a shotgun blast, we didn't look back. We just ran. Eventually, and by nightfall, we came across the dirt and gravel road that led to my aunt's house. We followed it to the house. My aunt had gotten home, and we told her that we had gotten lost. She said she was concerned, but it's easy to get lost in the woods around here. She was just happy that we had made it back. We told her about the strange old man and the scarecrow. She simply told us that there were some old hermits out in the hills, and it was best to do whatever you could to simply avoid them. That's why she didn't want us exploring too far away from the house. I'd like to tell you that we learned our lesson, and we didn't ever go back and get lost again. However, a talking scarecrow would be more believable than that. Wrong turn. One of the worst places you can get lost is when you're driving down dirt and gravel country roads in the dark. I know it sounds like typical horror movie plot devices, but in the area I grew up in, these roads were all over the place. There has been quite a bit of development in the years that have followed, and with technological development, it's probably harder to get lost nowadays than it was back then. I was 16 years old, and thus I had only began driving. I lived in town, and I was dating a girl who lived further out in the country. One evening she called me and let me know that her parents were going to be out of town overnight. She asked me if I wanted to come over, and of course I wanted to. I had never been to her house before, but I knew she lived up in the hills. But she gave me her address. I then got into my little beater car and I headed out. I hadn't been out long before it got totally dark outside. Once I was out of town, there weren't many street lights at all. I had to rely mostly on my headlights and the occasional street lamp to have any idea where I was. I wasn't completely sure, but I thought I saw my turn coming up. I was able to barely read the street sign, and it looked like the name she had given me, so I turned on the gravel road. Yeah, I was a 16-year-old boy, excited to be going to see my girlfriend alone. I guess the excitement was so overwhelming that I didn't even consider the fact that I may have made a wrong turn. Yet, after going down the road soon, it became very apparent that the road I was on was not the one I was supposed to be on. So you probably think I should have just turned around and gone back, right? Well, that was a lot easier said than done on those roads. The road was not wide enough for me to make a turn on, and as I was weaving through the hills, I didn't want to try it. I was too afraid I would drive off a hill and kill myself. My next thought was to look for a driveway in which to turn around, but the first two I came across were gated off. There was no room for me to turn around there either, so I kept driving. Now, I can see everything about that night as clearly today as I could then. I mean, nothing was clear. The only light came from my headlights. Thus, I could only see a little ways ahead of me. And there were so many twists and turns in the road that normally ahead of me was not as far ahead of me as I would have liked. And the road was so narrow that occasionally a tree branch would scrape against my car as I drove by. I finally came to a fork in the road, and I counted my blessings for that. I pulled into the fork and prepared to turn around. As I was pulling backwards, though, one of my tires went off the side of the road. I tried hitting the gas in order to get back on the road, but to no avail. I had a board in my trunk that I thought I could probably use to get myself out of the mess. So I put my car in park, got out of the car and went over to the trunk. I will admit I was scared to death. This was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. Although my lights were still on, other than that, it was completely dark outside. Opening the trunk, I was able to get the board out. While I was placing the board under the tire, I heard the unmistakable sound of a man screaming. It was a scream of pain unlike anything I'd heard before. I dropped the board and fell on my ass out of shock. Getting up, I looked around, trying to see what the noise might have been. It was coming from behind me, but it was far enough away that I had no way to see where it was. I almost dismissed it until I heard another scream. It sounded even worse than the first one. Not knowing what else to do, I fished around in my trunk for my flashlight. I began shining it all around, trying to catch a glimpse of what the scream might have been coming from. I heard one more scream, and then it was silent. I was terrified, and I knew I just needed to get out of there. I put the flashlight in the trunk and tried hard to get the board in place. I was nervous, so it was hard to do. But finally, I was able to pry it under the tire, and I figured that would be enough to give me some leverage to pull out of my predicament. Right when I was standing up, that's when I heard it. No, it wasn't another scream. It was the sound of footfalls on a gravel road. It was sort of a crunching noise, and what I was hearing was definitely not very far behind me. It was very close. I slammed the trunk closed and ran into the car. I slammed my door, locked it, and hit the gas harder than I should have. It was dumb, as I might have dislodged the board, but I didn't. It took a few tries, but I was able to get the car back onto the gravel road. I began to drive off, but I looked in the rearview mirror as I did, and I swear I saw a large, dark shadow standing right behind my car, illuminated by the rear red lights of the car. As I drove off, I realized that I had only barely escaped from whatever or whoever was out there. I was so scared driving around the area after that. I kept expecting something to jump out in front of my car, or something to jump out of the woods on the side of my car. It was terrifying, and I was not able to calm down until I got off of that gravel road and found my way to my girlfriend's house. We talked about it, and she told me that there are just some roads out there you shouldn't be traveling on. Next time, she told me, when you realize you made a wrong turn, just drive backwards to the main road. Discovery. This really is the scariest thing that ever happened to me. I've waited a while to tell this story because for the longest time I tried to not even think of it. But I think I've reached a point where I can actually tell someone else. This happened a few years ago. I got interested in the idea of exploring abandoned buildings by watching people on YouTube do it. I didn't want to start a channel or anything like that. I just wanted to have some fun and hope that I would find something interesting. When I originally started out, it was pretty mundane. I mean, I got to some buildings and looked around. I guess some of the junk that was left behind was somewhat interesting, but not really. Anyway, that changed when I decided to check out an old office building and factory that had been closed down since the 1980s. I wasn't really sure why it was never demolished. I sort of always think about that when I see these old and scraggly buildings. No one does anything with them anymore, so it doesn't really make sense to me why they just sit there for years and years and decades and decades. The office building wasn't easy to get to. The area around it was overgrown with vegetation. No one really seemed to take care of it very well. But I was able to muddle through and even found what seemed to be a path. I thought that perhaps other people have been exploring too, and maybe that is why there seemed to be a path there. For a moment I was worried about the possibility of running into someone, but I tried not to let that bother me too much. When I got to the building, it was much like the other buildings I had explored. This one was more interesting to me though. It was farther out, and harder to get to than the other ones had been. And this lent it an air of mystique or something. I'm not sure, but I really was much more apprehensive and interested in exploring it than I had been the others. Getting into the building from a broken window, I set about exploring the office building part. It was creepy because there were still cubicles, old desks and things like that. I sort of thought that maybe when the factory closed, they would have taken those things with them and sold them or something. But there were tons of old furniture, which now had become useless from sitting in an old building for so long. I honestly didn't find anything more interesting than that in the office building, so I thought I would head over to the factory part of the building and see what was up there. At least if they had left behind so much furniture and stuff, it was likely they may have left behind factory machinery or something, and that would be very interesting. I made my way through the office building, trying to find a way to the factory side of the building. When I finally did, I was actually stunned when I thought I heard voices coming from inside the factory. I wasn't sure if I was right or not, so I tried to listen a little bit more. And when I did, I was absolutely sure. There were voices coming from in there. At first I panicked. I thought maybe the people who owned the old building were there and they would find me. What would happen then? Would I get in trouble for trespassing? I wasn't sure. I tried to stay out of sight. I ran into a room with cubicles that had a wall facing the front of the factory. I peeked up through the window, trying to see if anyone was coming or going. There were no vehicles in front of the factory, so I figured the people who were there must have walked like I had. It took quite a while. I'm not even sure how long, but soon I watched 5 guys leave through the front of the factory door. They walked through the parking lot and eventually disappeared from my sight. My heart was pounding. I was both excited and a bit terrified, but I was also relieved that they had gone and had not found me. But that also got me thinking. What were the men doing in the factory? They hadn't taken anything with them when they left, so they weren't scavenging. Maybe they were using the factory as some sort of free storage. My curiosity was piquing, and it was getting the better of me. I decided I wanted to go into the factory and maybe find out if anything interesting was there. Hell, maybe they were drug dealers and stashed money in there. The buildings were connected, so I didn't have to go outside to get to the factory. I found my way to the entrance and was able to get inside quite easily. The factory itself was very interesting, as I had originally thought. There was lots of old equipment in it, but what really got me was how huge it was. It was one big, enormous room. I began exploring it, expecting to find drugs or money. I quickly made my way over to the area by the front door and began searching for it. I looked around behind all the equipment and everything. I was disappointed that at first I did not find anything. However, eventually I did find a door. It was a door to a small office. It was also locked, but I was prepared for that. It was an old door and took nothing more than a credit card for me to get into it. When I opened it and went in, I froze in terror and shock. I'm not exactly sure how long I stood in the office, shocked, before I ran out of it towards the factory entrance. I couldn't manage to hold it in, and I ended up throwing up before I got to the door. When I was done, I opened the door a little to make sure no one was out there. Then I opened it and left the factory. It had been at least an hour since those men had left. However, after what I had seen in the office, I was not going to take any chances that I might accidentally run into them. So I did not take the path that I had taken before. I took a much more difficult way out of the area. I was scared the entire way, thinking I would be caught, but thankfully I made it home safely. So, I know you want to know what I'd seen in the office. Well, I'm sure most of you have already figured it out though. There were dead animals in the room. Many different kinds, squirrels, rabbits, birds, and many others. And they weren't just dead, they were mutilated. I mean, some had their heads cut off, some had their limbs cut off, and although some of them were fresh, making me think they were killed by the 5 men that day, there were also animals that had been there for a while and were decayed. Oh God, I'm sorry I cannot finish explaining it. I'm about to barf again. So I'm sorry I can't give you more information than that. And no, I did not report it to the police. I have never told anyone about it before now. I couldn't bring myself to utter the words in any way until now. I had to have someone else type it up for me. Just be careful when exploring. Don't let your curiosity lead you down a wrong path. Playland. First off, I want to let you know that this story happened in the 1980s. So I'm aging myself by telling you that. I was 13 years old, and I was the type of kid who was just bored by about everything. I didn't have a cool video game system. I think Nintendo was available at the time, but I don't know for sure. There was ColecoVision and Television, Atari 5200. I, however, only had an Atari 2600, and I was bored of it. Me and my buddy Clay began going out and trying to find things to have fun with. He wanted to do some more douchey things, like stealing mail out of people's mailboxes, but I wasn't that much of a dick to do something like that. I mean, I wanted to do something that was a bit dangerous or something, but I didn't want to accidentally steal some old woman's social security check or something. After a bit, we finally found a good idea. We lived in a neighborhood that once you left it, there was this big field where sports were normally played. Behind the field, there was also a fence that blocked off what I guess was a marsh. You were not supposed to, under any circumstances, go over that gate into the marsh. There were signs posted all over the fence, forbidding people from trespassing and threatening prosecution. Well, Clay and I decided to go over the fence and explore what was on the other side. It wasn't that hard for us to get over the fence. It was fall, and the only sport played was football, and that was only on Friday, so the big field was empty. We made our way through, easily made it over the fence and into the marsh. And we found that the marsh really wasn't a marsh. It was just a forest. So that was a bit of a relief, as that made it easier to walk through. so we went exploring. There wasn't really too much to really get excited about behind that fence. I mean, there was the slight thrill of doing something illegal, but other than that, not much. It was just an unkempt forest. That is, until we came to a clearing and there was a building in the clearing. It was clearly abandoned. There was no way anyone could have come there on a regular basis through that forest. Plus it looked like crap. However, it did have a sign that indicated it was called Playland. We had never heard of it before, but both Clay and I were anxious to find out exactly what Playland was. So we went up to the door and we were surprised to find out that not only was it unlocked, but it was easy to open. Going inside, we immediately realized what it was. It was one of those Chuck E. Cheese or Showbiz Pizza type places. They had those games in it where you could play and get tickets and trade them in for prizes. There was skee ball and basketball throwing games and all sorts of that sort of stuff. Since it was like Chuck E. Cheese, we figured there might be a room with animatronic figures that sing. So we went looking for it. We got to some big heavy doors and opened them. We walked in on about 10 guys and gals, punk rocker types, sitting around doing drugs. Their eyes were open on us immediately as we came in. One guy who was kind of skinny but scary looking. I recall he had on a leather jacket that was pierced with all sorts of metal decorations, and a red mohawk and several facial piercings. Jumped up. He got up quick and came over to me. He pulled a switchblade and pushed me up against the wall. Clay tried to protest in my defense, but it was stupid of him to have tried that. Another one of the punks grabbed him.
"What the fuck are you doing here?" he asked us. "Did someone send you here?"
I was scared and blubbering. I'm not afraid to admit that. I told him that my friends and I were just out exploring and came across the building. We didn't know that anyone was inside. One of the female punks called, "He's lying, Crank. Just go ahead and gut him." The punk holding me, who I assumed was Crank, flipped the knife in his hand. He lowered it down to my crotch and not my stomach. He stuck the point on my jeans where I guess you could tell there was a slight bulge, although I was so scared I was surprised it didn't just shrink up to nothing, and pressed it against me. "If you're lying, you can guess what I'll do to you." I swore I wasn't lying. I was crying hard at this point, and I guess that made Crank believe me. "If you tell anyone, and I mean anyone, about what you saw here, I'll find you," Crank said, his face not even an inch away from my face. "And I'll cut off all of this." He swirled the tip of the knife around my entire crotch. I swore I wouldn't tell a soul, and I really meant it. I guess he could tell I was sincere, and he took me and kicked me through the door, where I momentarily landed on my butt. I was on my feet in seconds and running to the door. Clay was quickly caught up with me. We got out of Playland. It didn't stop running until we had cleared the marsh, the fence, and the field. I mentioned that Crank believed I was sincere when I said I wouldn't tell anyone. I meant it at the time. I have never told anyone until now, and all of my junk truly hopes Crank is not a Killer Orange Cat fan. Shack. This didn't start out as an adventure to find an abandoned building. This was just a hiking trip, really. But it ended up with us finding an abandoned building and some pretty disturbing discoveries, too. You first have to understand that my grandma had my dad when she was very young. And then he had a kid, me, when he was very young. Around the same time that I was born, my grandma was only in her mid-30s. She had another child in that time, who was only a year older than me. so he was technically my uncle. However, I didn't see him as an uncle, and we were a lot more like brothers. So when this happened, I was 14, and my uncle Jason had just turned 15. Jason and I set off into the woods around my grandma's house one morning just to go hiking. We tended to do this quite often. There was a lot of country in that area that gave us vast areas to explore. We usually would begin early in the morning in order to cover as much ground as possible. Now, I'm not going to try and describe everything we did just to make this story longer. I'm sure you know that we were hiking through the woods, up and down hills, and we were doing it for quite a while. And it was in the late afternoon when we found this cabin or shack or something like that out in the woods. Of course, being the ages that we were, our curiosity made it impossible for us not to go in and check it out. Going inside, it was obvious that the cabin was abandoned, even more obvious than it had been from seeing it outside. There was nothing in it that was necessary for a person to live. There was no furniture at all. There were no appliances, not even rustic ones. And unlike most rickety old buildings you might find out in the woods, there wasn't much of anything inside it. But after a little looking around, we did find a little metal box in the one closet in the place. And it was that metal box that made us wish that we had minded our own business and never went into the shack to begin with. The box was full of pictures. They were pictures of kids, and while the majority of the pictures were fine, as we flipped through them, there were pictures of kids that we wished that we hadn't seen. There were some pictures of kids in their underwear, and there were some pictures of kids in even less than that. And in those pictures, the kids were obviously unhappy, and some were obviously crying. We weren't really sure what we had stumbled upon, but it was obvious these pictures were very old. We brought the box back to the house to give to our parents, just in case there was something that needed to be done about it. Like if whoever took those pictures was still on the loose. They turned them into the sheriff's office, and really never mentioned them again to either of us. We were teenagers at the time, but those pictures really freaked us out. They really made us wonder how easily it may have been for someone to have done something like that to us when we were younger. It wasn't an idea we cared to have.
Stormy walk. Immediately after graduating from college, I got a decent job and bought a nice little townhouse in the city of Chicago. It was a decent neighborhood, which I was able to afford because I had a decent job. However, anyone who lives in Chicago, especially in certain areas, knows that often it can be more of a pain to have a car than to not have a car. So I opted to take the L to and from work and to do other things. There are a few things that do suck about taking public transportation everywhere. One is that not all the vehicles were necessarily very clean, and often, whether you are sitting or standing up, you might be thrust up against some unsavory or dirty people. And very, very often, you would find yourself having to walk through the elements, and that could sometimes be a pain. I had a job in an office building downtown. I really don't care to mention which one, but it was in the Loop. The thunderstorm was obvious, and I hadn't brought an umbrella with me. Although it wouldn't be much of a walk from the building to the subway station, it was a bit of a walk from my stop to the house. Had I been going to work, I probably would have sprung for a cab. It would have sucked to have been wet all day at work, but I couldn't really bring myself to do that on the way home. I absolutely hate taking cabs in Chicago, and I knew I could just dry off fine when I got home. The storm moved in pretty quickly. If you've never seen a thunderstorm from a high floor of an office building, I will say you're missing out. It was beautiful, The sky was a mix of black and dark green. The wind was strong, and it became nighttime outside when it was still supposed to be light outside. The thunder came soon after that, and it was so loud that I got audible oohs from some people in the office building. When it was time for me to go home, nothing much had changed. It had been raining and the storm was still going strong. I was quite lucky to be able to get from my building to the subway entrance without getting wet. Yeah, there were a lot of awnings, and I did my best to remain under them. Plus, it was only a few blocks away. I lived in a nice neighborhood on the north side of the city. As the L went on and came out from the underground, the storm was back on full display. There were tons of wet people on the trains, and I just decided to keep on my feet. When we got to my stop, it was still pouring outside. I got out, went down the stairs, and out the door. I was at that point under the bridge of the train itself, preparing myself to get totally soaked before I got home. It was completely dark out by this point, and not just because of the storm. The sun had set, and it was gone for the evening. As I mentioned, I wasn't very close to the stop, so although there were tons of people who got off the stop with me, by the time I got close to my street, I was walking by myself. I got to my street and turned on it, looking at the other houses as I walked down the street. It sort of made me miss living in the suburbs, because I didn't know any of these people. Likely I never would. But many living rooms were on full display. I got to the gate that would let me into my yard, and I don't know why I did it, but I looked up and scanned the windows. At the moment, I without a doubt saw a face looking at me from the window of my living room. I mean, it was only a split second, and then it was gone. But I knew exactly what I had seen. Someone was in my house, and no one should have been in my house under any circumstances. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there in shock for a few moments. I hadn't even put my key in to open the gate yet. I grabbed my cell phone and quickly called the police. While I was on the phone, I was faced away from my house, but when I turned around, I once again saw someone peeking out of my window. I was scared and hoped the police would hurry. I figured I should get as far down the street as I could. Before I could go anywhere, though, I saw the front door of my house open. Some guy came out of the house. He looked at me for a moment, then turned and ran down the alley between mine and my neighbor's house. I watched as he disappeared into the backyard. By the time the police had gotten there, he was long gone. But they had a good idea of who he was. The young lady I had bought the house from had a long and abusive relationship. The police had been at the house several times. The final time, after a brutal beatdown, the guy had completely disappeared. Fearing for her life, the woman sold the house and moved on. The police had his information and picked him up later. I was able to positively identify him as the man who had been in my home. He never knew his ex had moved away, and was waiting in the home for her to arrive. And with his history, there was no telling what he would have done to her, or to me, if I had entered the house in the darkness, and he didn't know I wasn't her. Someone. Every now and then, it is really hard to always know the difference between what is real and what is fake. I think that is the reason that many times you get so many stories on YouTube where parents don't believe their children. Whether that is from ghosts or monsters or other things, it seems to happen quite often. It seems like there is always a new story about a kid who has an imaginary friend who turns out to be a ghost or an intruder or something like that. Now, my story isn't exactly like that. Nothing paranormal happens in it. This was back in the 1990s when I was a teenager. I was 16 years old if I remember it correctly. I had a 12-year-old brother and a 7-year-old sister. During that time period, my parents were both working, and I ended up having to babysit quite a bit. This didn't bother me at all. It became more common when my parents got a second job on the weekends. Have you ever seen those brand new subdivisions that seemingly pop up overnight? And on the weekend, you'll see all those temporary signs that show and advertise them and give directions to their open houses and such. Well, on Friday night, my parents would go out and put all those signs up. Then on Sunday night, they would take them down. They had to wait until nighttime in order to put them up, and were usually gone from anywhere between 4 and 6 hours. I am relatively sure that this also took place in the early spring. I recall getting home from school after I had drama practice. It was still light outside, but it wouldn't be too long before that would no longer be the case. So I had to get home in time for my parents to get out and get their thing going. I had intended to make some hamburger helper and some stuffing for dinner, but my parents decided to spare a little bit of money for us to buy some pizza. I found out later that this was because they had heard on the news that a storm was coming in that evening. It didn't seem like it was going to rain to me, because the sky was clear. However, they believed it would, and this meant that they would be gone a bit longer than usual. So the pizza was sort of a way of saying sorry, that they would likely not be home before my siblings were in bed. My parents had only been gone for about 20 minutes when we noticed the wind picking up. This was followed shortly by sounds of thunder, which were getting closer and closer very quickly. So I ordered the pizza very quickly because I knew I would feel bad if the pizza delivery person got caught in the storm. And yeah, I know that seems like a silly thing to feel guilty about, but that was the sort of guy I was. And when I got off the phone, which was in the kitchen, I went into the living room. My brother and sister were both sitting down and watching television. I didn't pay attention at first to what they were watching, and took out one of my books in order to get a start on some homework. It was actually a few minutes that went by before I realized my brother was watching the X-Files. Yeah, probably not a big deal to anyone listening to the story, but keep in mind my younger sister was 7 years old. This was definitely too scary for her to be watching. Anyway, I put my sister in the kitchen and let her watch something else on the TV there. I did my homework at the table. By the time the pizza delivery had arrived, it was already storming hard. But after opening the door, the strange behavior of the delivery guy made me sort of uncomfortable. I let him into the foyer while I took the pizza and went to grab the money. When I came back, I noticed he had moved further into the house and was looking up at our staircase to our second floor. It was weird, but I was easily able to get him back towards the door when I told him that our parents would kill me if the carpets got soaked. While I was paying the guy, he started asking questions about the house. He said he thought the house was pretty nice, and wondered how much my parents had paid for it. I told him that I didn't know. He made a comment, saying that my parents must have had decent money, which I shrugged at. They didn't, or else they wouldn't have been out in the storm, putting up signs overnight. But that wasn't any of his business. When the guy asked me if the bedrooms were all upstairs, I decided I had to just get him out of there as quickly as I could. I didn't think he was dangerous, but I was just really creeped out by him. Around 9 o'clock, I had to go ahead and put my sister to bed. I could tell she was a little freaked out by the storm, and she was likely a little scared after watching some of the X-Files episode. So I kept her nightlight on and her door slightly opened. I waited for her to fall asleep, and then I went back downstairs to do my homework. About half an hour later, sitting in the living room, I noticed that my sister had come down the stairs. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that she thought she heard someone upstairs. This wasn't unusual for her. It didn't surprise me at all, but I doubted she had actually heard anyone, since the storm was so loud. Likely, she was just scared of the storm, plus the bit of the X-Files that she had gotten to watch. I asked her if she would feel better if I stayed in her room until she fell asleep. The readiness of her agreement just confirmed in my mind that I was correct. If she honestly thought somebody had been upstairs, she wouldn't have readily agreed to go back to bed so easily. So I took her back upstairs and put her to bed. It didn't take long for her to actually fall asleep. Once I was sure that she wouldn't be getting back up, I went ahead and went back downstairs to do homework. As the storm raged on outside, about 20 minutes later, my sister was up again. She came back downstairs. I always did my best to be as patient as possible with her. And again, this really wasn't that strange of an occurrence. When I asked her this time why she had gotten back up, she told me she heard someone walking around in her room. Her door was closed too, and she never, ever closed the door. But she had come downstairs. I prepared to take her upstairs again, but before I did, I heard something that was different than the storm noises, and this was undeniable too. I heard someone walking around on the top floor of the house. I froze and listened closer to try and make sure I knew what I was hearing. Undoubtedly, there were some definite footfalls coming from the top floor of our house. Someone was up there. My mind immediately thought back onto the pizza guy. He had been asking a bunch of questions about the house, including if the bedrooms were up there. He probably figured out that my parents were not at home as well. He could have broken into the house, since he had had the mistaken idea that we had money. I didn't hesitate, though. I wasn't the type to take chances. I quickly had my sister and brother put their shoes on, and we ran out the door to our next-door neighbor's house. From there I called the police, and was going to just wait for them to arrive. However, the husband was one of those gung-ho types, and he was going to grab his gun and check the house out. I was able to finally talk him out of it because if the police mistook him for the intruder, he might get shot. It didn't take long for the police to arrive at the house. There were 2 cars. 3 officers went to my house. I had left the door unlocked. The 3rd came over to the house we were in. I kept waiting, watching the house. I just knew that the officers were going to be hauling that creepy pizza delivery man out of the house. I prepared for it. I nearly braced myself for it. The police brought someone out of the house. I could easily tell, though, it wasn't the pizza delivery guy. I mean, this guy was much different looking and much smaller than the pizza delivery guy had been. I watched as they put him into the car before coming over to the house. The guy was a heroin addict who had been in and out of jail and was homeless. He'd actually broken into our house during the day when my parents were at work and we were all at school. He was looking for money or something to sell. However, my parents got home before he had a chance to get out. So, he holed himself up in my sister's bedroom closet. Several times he tried to make his way out of the closet, but wasn't lucky enough to do it. They did find a weapon on the guy. It was a knife, but they didn't believe that he was going to harm any of us if it wasn't necessary. He hadn't attacked my sister, who was the most vulnerable the entire time. But seriously, none of that alleviated the fear I'd felt that night. Just thinking that someone was upstairs and scared my sister, and I honestly thought it was just in her imagination. After school, I was 9 years old when this story happened, and I lived in a neighborhood that really wasn't the best around. But in spite of that, there wasn't much busing to and from school. Most of the students had to walk to and from. I recall many times walking in really deep snow, and really cold weather. Also, we sometimes did have to walk in the rain. That was usually really worse than the cold and the snow. Or at least, I always hated it. I stayed behind at school for about an hour and a half on this day. This was because there had been a storm waiting to begin for quite a while. I was hoping that it would pass over, or storm really quick and then stop. But it did neither of those things. So after a while I realized I was just going to have to walk home and brave the rain. I had an umbrella and a raincoat, but that didn't make me feel any better. I just hated the idea of being out in it at all. And that never kept my feet from getting wet, and I hated that the most. So I finally set out on the way home from school. It still hadn't begun raining at this point, and I thought I might actually have a chance of making it home before the rain fell. This was coupled with the realization that I had left school right when it was over. I would have been home already, and I would have missed the rain 100%. Well, you know what they tell you about hindsight. About halfway home, the rain began lightly falling. Distressed, I immediately got my umbrella out. I tried to hurry up and make it all the way home. As I was walking, I passed by this old home that I had never seen anybody at. There was a guy on the front porch. I had never seen him before either, but for some reason he got up and came out onto the front lawn. The house was across the street from me, but for some reason this guy began calling for me. I mean, he had to be calling for me, even though I didn't know him at all. I mean, there was no one else in the street other than him and me. "Hey kid, come over here," the man yelled at me. I stopped and looked at him, but I did not cross the road. "It's gonna start pouring any second here, kid. Just come over here and I'll call your parents. They can come and pick you up." I didn't know how to respond, but I was young and not too bright, so I told the man that both my parents were at work, so I couldn't call them. I then turned back and began walking a bit. Out of the corner of my eye, I was able to see the man walking in the same direction as I was. He called out to me again, saying that he could give me some cookies and hot chocolate while I waited for the storm to end. Again I stopped. This time, though, I didn't respond to him. I just turned away and began walking a little faster. This time, though, I noticed that he began crossing the street toward me, and he was walking fast, too. I immediately broke and ran to the closest house that I could get to. I began pounding on the door, which was quickly answered by another man that I didn't know. I pointed at the guy and said he was chasing me. The man from the house looked over and saw the man, who had turned and began running back down the road. He immediately understood something had gone wrong, and he began yelling at the guy running. He told him he better keep running, because he was going to call the cops. The second guy offered to let me come into his house, but I was alarmed at the idea. Understanding my predicament, he instead decided to walk me home. He got me all the way home, and that was when we got in touch with the cops. Well, the house that the man was at was not inhabited at all. It had been empty for years. When they went to check it out, the man who chased me wasn't there. My impression is that this man was just waiting along the road for a lone child walking home from school to abduct. I guess being caught in the rain was a very good excuse for him to try and get a kid to come into the house. Fortunately for me, this happened in the early 80s. There were many child abduction TV specials at that time, and I'd seen them all. I was absolutely not going to go into a stranger's house.